this on? Yeah, there it is. I know there's competition out there. I looked at the schedule and I see that there's a vodka tasting on starting in half an hour. So if people get up in about 25 minutes, I won't take that offense to that. I realize where your priorities perhaps lie. And I was thinking the other day, when I was a teenager, my parents are from a blue collar kind of working class family. And I remember they were celebrating their 25th anniversary, and it was the first time they were taking a real vacation. They went on a cruise, and so this was back in the 1970s. So I remember seeing a sort of picture. My mother was in a ball gown or a gown, and my dad had his best suit on. He didn't have a tuxedo, best suit. But I also remember when they came back, and my father had must have had a good time because his shirt, he couldn't button it up past about this button. It reminded me of how well they treat us here in the restaurants and at the buffet. So this is my last talk before we hit Reykjavik. And when I was thinking, every stop we've had, you've come around. This has really been, the stops have been really in rural Iceland, even though Reykjavik may have over 60% of the population in the area in Reykjavik. This part of the trip has really exposed us to a lot of the smaller communities in Iceland. It sort of gives us a good sense of what's taking place, at least in some of those communities. And although I've got the title economy here, really what we're talking about is the quality of life and the people that live in many of those communities and how they survive and how they try to lead high-quality, successful lives. The image here I've got, the middle one is on the road between Reykjavik and Akureyri, and you can see at least this part of the interiors still has those U-shaped valleys, but they're a little bit more rounded. It's not the same as some of the rugged shores we've been following along the coastline. And you've probably been exposed either in people talking about them or of seeing them. Some of the Icelandic horses, been told don't call them ponies, Icelandic horses. I was told by several people that it's not uncommon for urban residents to actually own some of these horses, but actually board them in the countryside. And they may not actually, they're almost like glorified pets in a way. I think what it does is it reminds me of the rural roots, because although we have a very large city in Reykjavik, a lot of the people still have rural roots, family roots in the countryside. So what am I going to look at today over the next 45 minutes? I'm going to start looking at how different levels of government work within Iceland and Europe in general, because it's very different, especially from a Canadian or a North American perspective, and how that kind of government, between federal, state, provincial, or local, actually plays into rural development in Iceland. And it forms sort of almost this rural identity in Iceland. I'm also going to cover the so-called famous Cod Wars, because it's sort of a geopolitical event in Iceland's history that helped solidify and reinforce the identity of the Icelandic people, especially from that rural perspective, given that many of the fishermen were from the rural areas. I'm going to look at rural tourism. As we've seen in almost every port we've stopped at, tourism is the mainstay, or one of the mainstays of some of those communities, and some of it's taken over from the fish processing plants that have either restructured or gone bankrupt. Finally, I'm going to go back to governance. I'm going to talk just for a bit about the social contract, and that's something that it takes place within many Scandinavian countries, and I talk about how that actually leads into giving rural Iceland a bit of an advantage. So to start, however, I'm going to talk in just a few slides about just the concept of development. And we often we tend to be very simplistic when we talk about development. We talk about the gross domestic product and so on. And so I'm going to look at 3 different indicators of development and how Iceland fares in relationship to that. This first one here is gross domestic product, or in other words, the total value of what's produced in goods and services in the economy, divided by the number of people. So it's GDP per capita for a number of the countries in rank order for 2024. And you can see that Iceland's GDP per capita, or its wealth per person, is actually very high in relationship to the 496 countries of the world. It ends up being, if I got here, it's ranked just over $90,000 US per person, just ahead of the USA and behind 4 other European countries and Singapore. Also not shown here, and one of the things that makes GDP simplistic, is income inequality. In other words, what's the gap between the very wealthy and the very poor in any given country or society? And in fact, Iceland has the 9th lowest gap, so the 9th lowest level of inequality of any nation in the world. And the 2nd lowest in Europe, and by lowest I mean best in that case. In other words, it's a more equal distribution of income. And of course, they have a universal health system and a universal education system right through to college or university. A second sort of indicator I want to look at, so if you go beyond just looking at a simple economy, the level of economy, people have come up with something that's a little bit better, and that's called a Human Development Index. And the Human Development Index just consists of 3 things now. One is still the economy. This is income per capita, just similar to GDP. The second one is health, and by health, they're looking at the life expectancy as a surrogate indicator for health. And they're also looking at education, and for education, they're looking at the average years of schooling of the population. Well, when you combine all those and put them all together into a number, you find that Iceland is actually the 3rd best or highest Human Development Index in all of the world. And finally, and I think Damien mentioned this in one of his port talks, I thought I'd be a little bit sort of off the wall here and look at, there is something called a happiness index. And it sounds a little bit weird, but the Gallup poll actually does a survey, a random survey of adults in every country of the world, or almost every country, on a rotating basis. And they ask a very simple question. It's about subjective well-being. They ask the question, evaluate your current life as a whole on a scale of 0 to 10. And then they sort of take that and they compare it to other sort of nations. And you can see that Iceland actually has the 3rd highest happiness of any country in the world. And it's 5, in fact, if you look at that top list there, 5 of the top 7 are Nordic countries. It tells you a lot about the quality of life within Scandinavian and Nordic countries as a whole. And just one other comment before I leave this, and that is that in my last talk I talked about the financial collapse in 2008, 2009, and how it hit Iceland so hard. Prior to that collapse, it was a very business-oriented society in Iceland. But they've actually, since 2010, they've probably moved back a little bit more to the more of what's called a Nordic kind of style of a model of governance and quality of life, in terms of something called a social contract that I'll get to. So let's look at government and governance in Iceland. For most North Americans in the audience here, we're familiar with a 3-tier level of government. We have the federal government that has certain levels of power and responsibility. We have state or provincial governments or regional governments. And then we have municipal or city governments. And in most of North America, the province or the state is the one that dictates to the city or what powers they can. So they devolve powers to the city. And the cities very rarely have the ability to tax. They actually have to ask permission to tax beyond municipal taxes, for example. That is not the case in most of Europe, and it's not the case in Iceland. In fact, in Iceland and in many parts of Europe, there's really no middle level. There's no provincial. There may be regions, and there, in fact, even in Iceland, there are regions. But in Iceland's case, it's really only for statistical purposes. They have very little power or control over the provision of services. It's had nothing to devolve. It's the federal government and the municipalities that have all the power in Iceland and many European and Scandinavian countries. So Iceland really has a two-tier government with 62 sort of municipalities. You can see them in all the different shades on the left-hand, on the right-hand side here, the right-hand diagram, upper right-hand diagram. And they do have, those municipalities have self-organized themselves into 8 regions, as you can see on the left-hand side. But there's not a lot of power to those. So there's an enormous amount of power, both political power and economic power to tax at that local level. So traditionally, when we think of government parties, we think of a right wing or a left wing or a conservative or a liberal or Labour or Republican or a Democrat. In Iceland, although they may have tendencies of that, it's just as easily you could have a rural-urban divide here. So Iceland is not a member of the European Union, and why not? They're largely not a member of the European Union because of the European Union's rules regarding fish catch and where countries' trawlers can go. There was a 1957 Treaty of Rome that said that all European countries are allowed to fish in each other's waters. And as you'll see both with the Cod Wars and have you seen in some other places we've been, fishing is very important, is part of their history and part of their culture. And so they don't want to actually adopt that because that would open them up once again to some of the quote-unquote foreign fleets coming into the waters that they deem as their own. But it is a member, Iceland is a member of the European Free Trade Association, and you can see the flags of that association here. And they're a member of something I talked about in my last talk, and that's the Schengen area. And the Schengen just allows for the free movement of people across member countries. So that's why there's been such a rapid increase in immigration, and why so many of those immigrants are from Eastern European countries that are part of the Schengen area, like Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria over the last little while. So a little bit on the historic role of fishing, because it is a rural activity. Vikings, when they came, they didn't start very much as fishers. They were herders, they were pastoralists, a little bit of farming, but not so much fishing. But by about 1300 AD, fishing was starting to become much more important than farming. You can see some of these images prior to the 20th century. Most fish was caught by hand lines. In Canada, we'd call that jigging. And the catch was salted. You can see them out salting the cod here in the sun, something we haven't seen of very much lately. Motorized boats were introduced in the 20th century, and there was a fishing boom, really, that came up right through and past World War II. So for the first half of the 20th century into the second half of the 20th century, fish constituted about 90% of the value of Iceland exports. So right there you can tell it's very important. So this is the Cod Wars. People sometimes portray this as a David versus Goliath kind of fight. And maybe it was, but maybe it isn't as well, as I'll explain in just a moment. This is really a fight that took place between two NATO members, North American Treaty Organization members, that lasted for about 30 years and served to strengthen the Icelandic identity and actually also shaped international law that we know of today. Fishing historically, as I said, it was very important for the Iceland economy. In the late 1800s, Denmark established a 50-mile limit around its waters, and those waters not only included Denmark, but also included the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, and so on. However, the United Kingdom ignored that, and given the backing of the British fleet at that time, Denmark had to back down. So the UK had a sufficient maritime presence that they were able to force Denmark to back away from that 50-mile fishing limit. And I think they eventually negotiated an end to that down to about a 3-mile limit. So the first Cod War took place in the early 1950s. And now Iceland is a nation now because it got its nationhood in the mid-1940s. And there was anger over British overfishing and that was existing right through to the end of the 1940s. And so Iceland decided to change its exclusive fishing limit range from, at this point it was 4 miles up to 5 miles, so one more mile out around the island. And the UK retaliated by banning all Icelandic fish processing being processed in the UK. So they thought this was going to force Iceland to back down. Unfortunately, what happened was the USSR came in and started buying all of Iceland's fish, and then the USA, not to be outdone, they came in and bought it as well. So the UK had to back down because they realized that Iceland didn't need to have processing facilities in the UK. 1958, they had to do it again, and Iceland actually pushed the exclusive zone out to 12 miles with some tensions rising. But the next Cod War took place in the early 1970s. And this is when Iceland extended it out to 50 miles. And although there's no Icelandic Navy, and there still is an Icelandic Navy, the Coast Guard got involved, and they did a very innovative or creative thing. They towed a long line behind the Coast Guard vessels with a large hook at the end of it. And it severed the lines of the trawlers. So the trawlers would lose their entire net, and they'd have to steam back to port. And it was very effective at it. In fact, for those of you who went into the museum at Ísafjörður, sorry for that pronunciation, you'll see that hook that was just outside the museum was actually one of the hooks that was used in the cutting of the nets escapades. They also had ships ramming each other back and forth, and until NATO got involved in here, and the UK backed down again. So, but the fish stocks were still decreasing. So it brings us to the third Cod War in 1976, and this is where Iceland said, "Listen, we need to extend this out to 200 miles." So there was more ramming incidents, and I think in one of your port talks you saw this image here. This is of the HMS Mermaid ramming one of the Icelandic Coast Guard vessels. So Iceland at this time threatened to leave NATO and to close the military base at the Keflavik airport in Reykjavik. So the United States stepped in because they didn't want this happening, and they put pressure on the UK, and the UK backed down again. So throughout these conflicts, nobody was killed, and no ships were sunk. So eventually that 200-mile limit became the norm. And you remember, I think in one of my talks earlier, I talked about exclusive economic zones and the law and the Convention of the Sea. That 200-mile limit was actually the one that was adopted for internationally as the standard for every country having a 200-mile limit. Cod stocks recovered, and this incident strengthened the Icelandic identity. And they felt that they defeated a much larger opponent, and they did have little help from their friends. 1970s, 1980s, there was really no regulation on fishing, even though it was only Icelandic fishing boats now. And so the government started worrying about the sustainability just from their own fishermen taking too much of the cod stocks. So government brought in a total annual limit and then gave licenses or quotas to each of the fishermen that was there. And they started then privatizing the entire industry. And that did a lot of things. One of the things it did was it started sort of almost a consolidation of it, a restructuring of the industry, so that people started buying and selling licenses on the open market or on the market without being forced to pay any taxes. And so a number of license holders were earning enormous amounts of money by selling their license. So there was a consolidation of the licenses into fewer hands. And so I think in a period of about 5 years, there were 282 mergers just in terms of the fishing companies that had licenses in the fishing communities. And most of them, as you can see, are in the north and east of Iceland. It created these almost like little kings in the fishing communities, in the consolidated fishing communities, but it also meant that some of the fishing communities had lost their fish processing too. It therefore also forced them to become much more creative about your future economic development. But following the collapse, what happened was the financial collapse in 2010, some of those communities actually bounced back because prices and supply were stable. The prices of cod were stable, supply was stable, and the value of the krona went way down. And so their exports then became much more competitive internationally. And you can see this image on the top right actually is unemployment rates in 2009. So right at the height of the financial collapse. And you can see that actually the unemployment rates in some of the rural areas in the north and east are much lower than they were in Reykjavik at the time. And you can see the image on the left-hand side to the lower left is the total fishing catch. It's leveled off right over this past decade, right up until about now. So the cod stocks haven't collapsed again. So that's sort of the fishing part of it, and the cod wars. I want to talk a little bit more about community development and sort of authenticity. And I think we've seen a lot of authenticity in some of the ports we've been going to the last little while. One of the PhD students I had the good fortune to supervise did her PhD thesis on mural art on the buildings in a community on Vancouver Island on the west coast of Canada called Chemainus. And Chemainus had gone through a major employment loss, restructuring of their sawmills and lumber mills. So they were all closed and they didn't know what to do. So they decided, because they were very close to sort of a large population, that they'd try to become much more creative and artistic. And so they actually had professional paint images on the sides of the buildings that were reflective of their own history and culture of that area. And in addition to that, many more artists opened up, cafes and so on, and they became known very much as a touristy town. The thesis that she wrote actually had a subtitle to it, and it said, "Jumping on the Bandwagon." As what happened, of course, as often happens with development schemes, is that if it's successful, everybody else wants to copy it. And that's where the authenticity is lost, because these strategies, as we've seen in the communities we've gone to, are specific to the assets or the skills of the people that are there. And so if it has to fit with what exists there, it can't be contrived, it can't just be reproduced. I put this in here because it looks like it's an example where, even though they're murals again, it actually wasn't contrived, wasn't authentic, or was authentic. In this case, this is the community of Hellisandor, 200 kilometers or 120 miles north of Reykjavik. And it's called the street art capital of Iceland. And it has a similar history to Chemainus, British Columbia, where they had a closure of the fish processing plant. And so they brought a number of international artists in, and they created 30 murals on the buildings, including a number of murals on the closed fish processing plant, by the way, sort of ironic. And they now celebrate these murals, they celebrate the history and culture of that community, and they've brought many tourists back into the community based on that. So let's look at another transformation of something old to something new in terms of development in some of these small communities. And that's whaling. And this is from whale catching, and I think you probably know what the other half of it's going to be, to whale watching. Unlike other areas in the Arctic, whaling was not a traditional activity in Iceland because there wasn't an indigenous population here. So it only started in the late 1940s, 1948. And most of the production actually wasn't actually consumed in Iceland. It was exported to Japan. In a 2013 survey, only 3% of Icelanders ate whale meat regularly. For most of it was tourists that were eating it in restaurants, or as I said, it was exported. And the consumption of whale meat started to decline precipitously over the period from the early 2000s and on. So that in 1962, it was 232,000 tons of whale meat was harvested. But by 2021, there was only about 1,000 to 2,000 tons. So it was almost disappeared at that point. And the price of whale meat decreased. And up to 2017, whaling generated only about $11 million per year. And you're starting to see a whale watching coming up. And so there's almost a turning point where whale watching was earning more in revenue for the communities than the whaling itself. In 2019, the Icelandic government had a quota of 2,000 fin and minke whales, but it didn't even get to that point, and they eventually just shut it down completely. So whale watching is now as some of us have already seen, is a much stronger element of the whale industry, if we want to call it that, especially in these rural communities. There are more than 350,000 tourists that go whale watching annually. And just the most recent figures I've got are for 2019-2020. It earned about $30 million US a year. So it had gone up from that last number I mentioned. And there's actually even new research that's showing that whales, the large whales, actually serve as carbon sinks, capturing carbon from the atmosphere. Each great whale captures 33 tons of CO2 a year. And that's one tree would be 48 pounds. So each whale captures about the equivalent of about 1,300 trees in carbon. Although whale watching excursions, some of them are out of Reykjavik, the large percentage of whale watching excursions are out of rural communities, and this is one out of Reykjavik in northern Iceland that calls itself the whale watching capital of Europe. So let's look at the transportation corridors here as well, because transportation is very important for Iceland's rural development. The history of the roads in Iceland, until the 20th century, there are very few intercity roads. They were really connected mostly by coastal boat. In fact, if you've been on some of these tours, it struck me at least 2 or 3 times the guides have said, oh yeah, I had to, they were talking about a community 2 or 3 fjords over, 2 or 3 fjords north or south. I thought, that's a very strange way, from my perspective, to talk about a neighboring town. I might say, well, it's 10 miles up the road or 15 miles up the road. But because they really didn't have a history of intercity road transportation, they thought of it in terms of how many fjords away the nearest town was or where their friends lived. Thought that's instructive just in terms of how they think about distances and places around them. For tourism, road travel, however, is becoming much more important. 60% of tourists rent a car. In my last talk on tourism, I talked about the Golden Circle, the one that sort of was about 190 miles right around beginning and ending in Reykjavik. But there is another circle, the Ring Road, or Route 1. In fact, I think in some souvenir shops you can get a Route 1 sign similar to the Route 66 sign in the United States. And this is about 820 miles, or about 1,320 kilometers, and it could take anywhere from 7 days to 8 days to 10 to 12 days, depending on how leisurely you drive around there. This image shows that that ring road, it goes almost around the entire coast. The only part it misses is some of the western fjords and some of the northeastern area. And as you can see, it connects most of the major towns or small cities there. And it's now that ring road is being marketed to international tourists as part of their an expedition, or a 7 to 10 day expedition. And that image back to the bottom left there is from Lux Adventure Tours advertising the ring road. And interestingly enough, our youngest son, our 25-year-old son, is actually just completed that ring road yesterday with his girlfriend and her family. And I think it took him about 7 days to do it as well. And so I was talking about, this is a very scientific survey, obviously, here. I was talking to him and I said, well, what's your perspective having just done this? And these are just a few things he said. So, and I trust his opinion. He said, it's interesting to explore all of the different campsites that sustain many of the small remote towns. And grocery stores are all along the highway for easy access. And finally, some of the grocery stores for camping towns have more tourists in them than locals. So although that intercity, that ring road I'm sure serves a great purpose for locals, it's designed as much for tourists. I mentioned before about authenticity and tourism as an economic development. Many of the regions and communities have become very creative about trying to attract the tourist dollar. And that's because they're basing it on local knowledge and understanding of either crafts or music or folklore, or whatever they have as an advantage. And they're trying to connect it to their place or their community with an emphasis, as I said, on authenticity that might attract tourists. Some of the examples here, the Hundiping Vestra, you can see this region of over about 3,000 square miles, but it only has a population of 1,200 people, and they're known as the Icelandic Seal Center, and it serves as a gateway to a number of sealing activities, not necessarily seal fishery, but rather seal watching, demonstrations of how they would use seal pelts in different places. And this is supposed to strengthen, this seal center is supposed to strengthen the network of surrounding communities that actually, and operators that have a role in the seal industry, seal tourist industry. A second example of how creativity can create development through tourism is the annual arts festival, the Linga Art Festival, that actually we were in the community right near there yesterday in Sedersfjordur. And in this case, they have an annual arts festival that brings people not only from all Iceland but elsewhere as well. So they pride themselves on their cultural and artistic or creative characteristics. Farming in Iceland has gone through some difficult times recently, and in fact it's rare that actually farmers are able to make a go of it without actually combining other things as part of their household income. And what we find now is that many of the farmers in Iceland have either taken second jobs within the tourist sector or are opening up their farms to a form of agritourism, where they actually invite tourists to participate in the farming activities. And here's a couple of examples here. On the right-hand side is a tourist riding, or it's sort of riding horseback. So the horse farm is opening it up for tourists who want to go horseback riding in Husavik. And on the left, it's a family sheep farm just about 1 hour north of Reykjavik. So agritourism is also very important. We're looking at immigrants. I mentioned immigrants before in another presentation and how they've increased their presence. I think in the early 2000s, it was only about 2% of the population, but now the most recent figures has it about 17% of the population. So 65,000 people were not born in Iceland. This image here, this diagram shows that although many of them have still settled in the Reykjavik area, a fairly large percentage, and you can see the percentages on the left-hand side here, have settled in some of the smaller regions around the rest of Iceland. And their presence is quite variable. It varies tremendously depending on, and largely if there's still a fish processing plant, you tend to have a lot of immigrants because fish processing is not a job that appeals to a lot of Icelanders and many sort of people in the developed country. Immigrants are a critical component of the workforce in many of these communities. This image to the left actually shows mostly foreign workers in a fish processing plant. And in this case, it's a place we've already been to, Ísafjörður, and most of the workers in there are Polish. And in fact, even in town, if you don't noticed it in town, but there is a Polish food store dedicated with Polish food. Historically, immigrants were employed in the fish processing and the heavy industry sectors. But increasingly, they're playing a role in tourism and services and in construction. And these are sort of still fairly lower skilled, some of them are less pleasant jobs. In 2023, 45% of tourism sector jobs and 34% of construction jobs were taken by immigrants. Now, one of the challenges immigrants are facing is integration within Icelandic society. I've looked at some research that shows that if you're an immigrant from a Nordic country, you're very well accepted. Even if you're an immigrant from a place like Poland that has a long history now of immigration to Iceland, you're accepted. But the more recent immigrants from other Eastern European countries are having a more difficult job integrating and being accepted within Icelandic society. Remember I talked about the Nordic social contract just a moment ago? The social contract in many Scandinavian countries, including Iceland, is that the government guarantees they'll provide essential services in many cases regardless of location, regardless of geography. And so they believe it's the collective responsibility of the government, including to provide education, healthcare, and physical and digital infrastructure to communities almost regardless of how small they are, the basic human needs. Most nations, most developed nations don't have that. They've based an efficiency-based model, a hierarchical model where the smallest places, they don't necessarily guarantee a lot of those services. And I want you to think of that in relationship to this one example I've got here, an example of providing rural services, a provision. So this is a tunnel that was built, the Heiðnsfjörður tunnel, in 2010 between two towns just to the north and west of Akureyri. And the two towns had populations of 1,200 and 800 respectively people. So building that tunnel, the distance between the two towns went from 62 kilometers in the summer to 17 kilometers apart. And it cost over $106 million to build the tunnel in 2010. So that's a perfect example of how not only rural political power that's expressing itself, but the social contract, the fact that it doesn't matter that it's only 2,000 people in total, and that it only cuts it down by 40 kilometers. It's important to increase that level of accessibility. So I'm going to start to end this talk by talking about post-secondary in the rural areas as well. The federal government has also actively promoted pushing out degree granting universities and colleges throughout the rural places. So for example, and that's to try to retain young people in those areas or to attract other young people who might go to school there and stay there. In addition to the education, they're also emphasizing research. So there's a lot of master's programs and PhD programs and companies that are being established that rely upon the research that's taking place there. If you look at the images to the right here, this is Hólar University. And Hólar University is actually one of the oldest universities around. It started in 1106 AD, and it's located just south of, in the interior, just south of Akureyri. And they have master's programs in aquaculture and fish biology, in equine studies, or horse studies, and in rural tourism. Akureyri University, and this is a picture of it on the left, I don't know if any of you got up there through your tours in Akureyri. They only have 1,400 students, but they have a lot of master's programs and PhD programs in many other fields. So in community and rural development, it's the people that make the difference. You have to have the infrastructure there, but it's the people that actually determine what assets they have and how to employ those. You often have to find a form of organization and mentorship and leadership and funding actually to allow the people to actually express their own creativity. But then you let the people lead that rather than forcing some kind of standard development plan on them. You've seen that, I think, in some of the communities we've been to over the last 5 or 6 days. Meeting some of the people that have been part of that community, how they've been very creative in terms of how they adapt and how they actually, whether it's 2 or 3 jobs they hold, in order to make ends meet. And that really sort of is a good segue for me to the people that make a difference, not only in the communities themselves, but the communities on the community on this ship. Especially for those of you who are departing at Reykjavik, I've enjoyed getting to know you, and I appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to come here in person or watch my talks on Viking TV. But I would like to have you join me in thanking the technicians at the back that have allowed this to happen, the crew behind the scenes, the guest services staff, the cruise director Damien and the assistant cruise director Patricia, as well as the captain and his crew, all of whom have made this a memorable experience. So thank you very much. And as usual, at the back there, if you want to ask me any questions.